evening, everyone. I'm Vicki Wilkins, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this evening's event. I want to start the evening with gratitude for our co-sponsors, the Russell Sage Foundation. I'm thankful not only for their support of this evening's event, but also for the sustained commitment they have shown to supporting impact in policy relevant research. I'd also like to thank the SPA events team for their hard work in making this event happen. Thanks to all of you. Tonight's event is a celebration of the release of the second edition of Cradle to Kindergarten, a new plan to combat inequality, authored by Ajay Chaudry, Christina Weiland, Harazoku Yoshikawa, and SPA's very own Taryn Morrissey. The book is published by Russell Sage Foundation and is a celebration of education. This book provides evidence that early access to quality education, to quality healthcare, has lasting impacts on long-term socioeconomic success. I'd like to thank Dr. Weiland and Dr. Chaudry for participating in tonight's discussion, as well as our other discussants, Miriam Calderon from Oregon's Early Learning Division, and Melissa Boteach from the National Women's Law Center. I'm also glad to see Ruth Marcus. Ruth was a 2019 Sine Institute Fellow and has come back to us, at least virtually, to moderate this discussion. Welcome back, Ruth. And I'm thrilled that Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia will be joining us. We are glad to host him here with us tonight. At the School of Public Affairs, we are fortunate to count among our faculty scholars who offer insight into how to shape stronger policies across a variety of fields through evidence-based research. Events like tonight's are an expression of our values in action, a chance to elevate public discourse and drive progress in policy, politics, and administration. So thank you again for spending time with us this evening. And now I will turn it over to Taryn Morrissey. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicki. And I want to thank again the American University School of Public Affairs and the Russell Sage Foundation for co-sponsoring this event and for publishing our book, the original book back in 2017, as well as our second edition this year. So we're very fortunate to be joined by Congressman Bobby Scott, although he is in the midst of voting. So we will welcome him when he is able to join us. First, Christina Weiland and I wanted to share a few slides or an overview about the book. So I am very excited for this timely and important discussion about policies that promote young children's learning, economic growth, and reduce disparities in opportunity. And now you've all seen my notes for a little while too, so thanks for bearing with me. These disparities and inequalities have only widened since the original book was published in 2017, and especially in this last year. Before the discussion with panelists, we want to provide an overview of our book, its motivations, and our policy recommendations, and why we did a second edition. And Chris Weiland and I will share a few slides. So first, why another edition of Cradle to Kindergarten? Well, in the last 4 years, I'm sure each of us has felt and experienced the change in the American political landscape, as well as the policy landscape in the world. Inequality, which was high in 2017, has only grown. In the last 12 months alone, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed starkly to the public, especially employers and state and local leaders, how incredibly threadbare our childcare and early education systems are. Also, since 2017, the four of us have worked with and learned from stakeholders in several states and cities, working on what we refer to as Cradle to Kindergarten plans and cost estimates. We learned much more about how our 2017 plan might work in very different state contexts and how much more might be needed to make our proposals work. Each of these events and contexts shifted our thinking in terms of recommended proposals, investments, and their scale. And we address these in the second edition of our book, but our evidence-based assessment of the problem and our main policy framework remain, however. So our original book in 2017 and the second edition was motivated by 3 evidence-based trends or takeaways. First, income, racial, and ethnic disparities in achievement and development are large, and begin well before children enter kindergarten. So this slide shows the magnitude of the gap and how consistent it remains from age 4 to 8th grade. These gaps are large. There is more than one standard deviation difference in achievement measures between children in families at the bottom 10th percentile of income, so very low income children, compared to those in families in the 90th percentile of income or high income families. And as you can see, the gap grows as children age through elementary and then middle school, but most of the gap is present by age 4. A second takeaway is that these achievement gaps map on to disparities in young children's experiences and opportunities. In particular, there are large disparities in access to and in the use of early care and education by family income. Here we see that center-based early care and education attendance increases with children's age, but rates vary greatly with income. A 1-year-old from a high-income family is about as likely to attend center care as a 3-year-old from a low-income family. Moreover, when they are enrolled in centers, children from lower income families tend to attend lower quality programs than their higher income peers. And then third and finally, despite the reams of evidence we now have that demonstrate the rapid rate of brain development in the early years and the power of high quality early learning experiences for promoting children's development, we invest the least in education during early childhood. So that is, public investments in children are the lowest in the developmental and learning period when they matter most, from birth to age 4, before children enter universal publicly supported schooling, typically at age 5. Federal and state government expenditures for children under age 3 average about $5,000 per child, a fraction of the approximately $14,000 per child in public investments for children 6 and over. Public programs like Head Start, state preschool, and childcare subsidies expand access to early learning, but currently reach only a small fraction of those eligible. So as a result, parents pay for the majority of costs of early care and education, and the children of those who cannot afford the high costs lose out. The pandemic and its economic crisis decimated the early care and education sector, leading to the closure of many programs, the exit of mothers from the workforce, and learning loss among children, all disproportionately affecting children in low-income families and children of color. These problems result from decades of underinvestment in young children and new parents. COVID exposed and widened the disparities in early opportunity, but did not create them. And the good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. We have evidence-based policies that can expand opportunity and narrow inequality. And moving forward, we need emergency relief as well as long-term investments in early childhood as both educational and economic infrastructure. Our policy proposal offers an evidence-based, cohesive plan with 4 components that establish a birth to 5 infrastructure. First, paid parental leave as social insurance for the critical earliest weeks of children's development. Second, a reliable guarantee of affordable childcare. Third, universal early education that starts at age 3. And fourth, a reimagined and expanded Head Start program that begins early and provides continuous comprehensive services to the children facing disadvantage until they enter school. And so today we'll focus on childcare and universal preschool, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Christina Weiland.
Thank you, Taryn. So I'm going to walk through, as Taryn said, in detail 2 pillars of our proposal, and the first is childcare. So our current context, we have a situation in which for decades, high quality, reliable childcare has been a need that most families have, but it's incredibly hard for them to actually find and access. Only about 14% of eligible children receive childcare subsidies through the federal and state child care and development fund, CCDF. States establish most subsidy program rules. Those vary tremendously by state and are quite complex for families to navigate, which contributes to some of the access problems. And we also provide some child care tax credits, but these are quite minimal and not refundable, so they're really not getting to the folks who need them most. So our proposal would really turn the page on this current context. So we would offer a child care guarantee in our proposal to all eligible working families to subsidize high quality care and education. Specifically, families with income up to 150% of their state's median income who have children under 5 would be eligible. There would be co-payments on a sliding scale up to 7% of income, with those at 75% of state median income and below paying nothing. Subsidies would also be adequate to pay for quality and to move families into the type of care that they prefer. Choice is really central to all of our book and our proposals. We'd also include investments to build childcare supply, which are going to be increasingly critical as we try to recover from the devastation of the COVID-19 crisis on the early care and education sector. And finally, we also propose an increased refundable childcare tax credit that would cover a proportion of paid costs for all types of paid care for children aged 0 to 13, with maximum benefits increased to $4,000 for one child and $8,000 for two. In terms of our universal early education program, our current context in the US, as you heard from Taryn, we have these tremendous access gaps nationally. We do have a few states and cities that have universal preschool programs for 4-year-olds. Other states have none at all. We have fewer programs on the whole for 3-year-olds that are publicly accessible. The programs that we do have vary tremendously across a lot of dimensions, including governance, location, hours of service, workforce, and their quality assessment across states, and that adds up to very variable quality nationally across the context that families live in. We have only small discretionary federal grants that support this piecemeal system. Our proposal would offer voluntary universal preschool for children ages 3 and 4. We really took pains to match the best science of early childhood education. So we have research in this area in particular that goes back over 40 years. And so we would offer the program in a mixed auspice setting, so schools and community-based settings with a full school day, a longer school year with wraparound care options so that working families truly could access the program. Another pillar of the plan would be pay parity with K-12 teachers so that our preschool teachers are not incentivized to leave for K-12 as they are in many systems across the country to be paid more and support their own families. We also have detailed plans for consistent, transparent quality standards. Those include developmentally focused curricula paired with coaching on those curricula in the classroom from a trained mentor teacher. We also would sequence quality investments like curricula across 3 and 4-year-olds and align with K-3 education so that children aren't simply repeating what they've already learned in an earlier year. Curricula too would need to be culturally responsive to meet the needs of diverse learners in our classrooms. And we would prohibit expulsion from preschool classrooms. Turning to the cost of our plan, so we have lots of details on this in the book. And so here we're just giving you a quick snapshot before we launch into the discussion. So we have detailed both funding and service levels currently, what they would be under the Cradle to Kindergarten funding plan and service level plan. And so in total, just to sum this up, but we could certainly return to this if folks are interested, the plan would require about $116 billion in new investments. And that in total is about half of 1% of our GDP. So not even getting to 1%, just a little under half of 1% of our GDP. And so to wrap things up, so our bottom line is that investments in a comprehensive, cohesive infrastructure for early childhood services really can promote kids' development, support working families, and promote economic recovery and growth. We are at a historic moment where we have a federal, state, and local level opportunity to design and implement services. Probably the public will to have investments in those areas higher than it's been in a very long time. And we have really a responsibility to support the early childhood sector to recover, and families too who have been hit so hard by the crisis. We were informed in our development of the second edition by the Child Care for All Working Families Act, led by Representative Bobby Scott, who's able to join us today, and Senator Patty Murray. So we had some input into that, and we're also very much in the second edition informed by some principles of that plan. And as Taryn outlined to the second edition, we want to make sure to mention our many partners: Colorado, District of Columbia, New Jersey, Oregon, Washington, and New York City, who really embraced principles of the C2K, Cradle to Kindergarten, in their own context, for moving forward with local priorities there. And we've learned a ton from them, and we have been so grateful for their partnership and are thrilled that one of our partners in Oregon is able to make it today. So I'll conclude by saying thanks to the American University School of Public Affairs and the Russell Sage Foundation for sponsoring the event. And thanks again to all of our panelists and our audience for able to join us tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks again for bearing with me and my technological problems. So very fortunately, we are lucky to have Representative Bobby Scott join us this evening. And I am honored to introduce him as well. He is excuse me, sorry, he is Representative Scott chairs the House Education and Labor Committee and is a long-standing champion for young children and workers, including childcare workers. And among his many accomplishments and efforts, he and Senator Patty Murray developed and spearheaded the Child Care for Working Families Act, which, as Chris just mentioned, really informed our thinking very much with the second edition as well. And it would dramatically expand access to affordable, reliable, high quality early care and education and move the needle in expanding opportunity and in reducing inequality. So Representative Scott, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, and it's certainly a pleasure to be with you. I heard your presentation and Dr. Weiland's presentation. So I want to thank both of you and Dr. Chaudry and Dr. Yoshikawa for your work on the second edition to Cradle to Kindergarten. And that we've already heard that the recommendations of this book reflect many of the policies that we're working on now. In my capacity as chair of the Committee on Education and Labor, and working with Rosa DeLauro and Patty Murray in the Senate to expand access to high quality, affordable early childhood education and care for all children. These proposals could not come at a more critical time. This pandemic has been a stark reminder of the importance of early childhood care and education, both for families and for our economy. Access to affordable, high quality early childhood care and education provides children with a strong start in life. We've already heard that a child's brain grows most rapidly during the first 5 years of life, making the early childhood period critical for interventions that support lifelong learning. And unfortunately, if a child misses high quality opportunities during this early stage, they'll never catch up. The pandemic has also made clear that early childhood care and education are critical to supporting working parents, particularly working mothers. A staggering number of mothers with children have been pushed out of the workforce due to the lack of accessible childcare. And this tells us that a strong economy, if we could ever recover from the pandemic, from an economic point of view, you can't do that unless you have a functioning early childhood education and childcare system. And we can't build that system without supporting childcare providers. Childcare providers have long operated on razor-thin margins because they have high labor costs and have to balance that with what families can afford. And now the pandemic is imposing even a bigger threat for providers who've been left vulnerable to the consequences of the global emergency. At the height of the pandemic, at least half of our country's childcare providers were at least temporarily closed, and hundreds of thousands of childcare workers had lost their jobs. Today, providers who are open and serving families are grappling with the problem of steep costs to deal with the pandemic and keeping children and staff safe. The hard work of the Education and Labor Committee, with the hard work of the Education and Labor Committee, Congress has made significant progress towards providing relief in childcare settings. And just last week, for example, the president signed the American Rescue Plan, which the House passed last month to secure urgent relief for children, students, workers, and families. This historic legislation will cut child poverty in half by increasing food assistance, expanding the child tax credit, preserving unemployment benefits through September, and putting $1,400 in the pockets of millions of Americans. This package also fulfills the goal of the Child Care is Essential Act, which I championed through the House last year with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. The American Rescue Plan includes $39 billion to support child care providers through the Child Care Development Block Grant. It also secures an additional $1 billion for the Head Start program, which serves the most economically vulnerable young children. This funding adds to the $10 billion that Congress appropriated through the end of the year package in December to ensure that we invest a total of $50 billion that the sector needs to weather the pandemic. However, as we know, averting the collapse of the child care sector is not enough, as the Cradle to Kindergarten highlights, high quality early childhood care and education is far too inaccessible, and that was the case even before the pandemic. Congress has a clear responsibility to ensure that all children have access to opportunities that will help them thrive throughout their lives. And to that end, we're going to soon be reintroducing the Child Care for Working Families Act, which makes long-term improvements to support child care providers and ensure equitable and affordable access to child care and preschool for all families. That legislation will ensure low and moderate income families can access high quality, affordable child care. It would support universal access to high quality preschool and invest in our child care workers to ensure that they're compensated for the true cost of providing care. Each of us shares a commitment to expanding access to quality early childhood care and education. So please know that we're going to continue to fight alongside my colleagues and today's distinguished speakers who were very helpful in developing our legislation to ensure fair compensation for child care providers and a strong start in life for all of our nation's children. So I want to thank you again, particularly to the authors for their work in Cradle to Kindergarten, and look forward to working with each and every one of you as we prepare the children to lead us in the next generation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm Ruth Marcus, Deputy Editorial Page Editor and columnist at the Washington Post, and your honored moderator today. I'm honored in the sense that I'm honored to be here. Thank you to AU and the School of Public Affairs and all the authors and panelists for the really, really important work that you do. And thank you, Congressman Scott, for the really important work that you do translating the thinking and knowledge here into hopefully legislative reality. On that score, I thought maybe, Congressman, we could start with you in terms of questions, because I'm not sure how long we have you as our victim here, and ask you how you see the legislative landscape going forward. As you pointed out, there are a number of provisions in the American Rescue Plan that are temporary, but potentially transformative, especially if they could be renewed going forward. At the same time, Congress has spent a lot of money on a lot of urgent priorities that will raise questions about how much more money there is to spend down the road. So could you talk about how you see the legislative landscape going forward in light of all of that?
Could you hold a minute? David, can you check to make sure I voted on this bill? Yeah, we're in the middle of votes, so I apologize for the.
We totally understand.
We did a lot in the rescue plan, in one of the major things is reducing child poverty about 50%. And we hope that that's temporary. That's the nature of the bill and reconciliation, but we hope to make that permanent. I would be surprised if anyone would try to stay in the way of making it permanent. You know, it is such an accomplishment that we wouldn't want to turn the clock back. So hopefully we can keep the progress and keep the things we've done, not just for this year, but make it permanent. We have a problem with the Senate. The Senate is frankly dysfunctional. It has nothing to do with the appropriations. I mean, they'll have a problem passing anything. And the fact that this bill did not get a single Republican vote, although it was polling positively with a majority of Republicans and about 70% overall, couldn't pick up the first Republican vote. If you can have any substantial legislation, how popular would it have to be before you can get the first vote? Not just all the Democrats and 10 Republicans, the first Republican. And if they can't do better than that, they have a problem that's unrelated to any particular legislation. They're gonna have to figure out how they can function as a legislative body. When they figure that out, then we can deal with the issues of how we're gonna make more progress on eliminating child poverty. As I indicated, you're not gonna reopen the economy without effective childcare and opening the schools. We provide the resources I believe necessary for school systems to comply with the CDC guidelines so they can open safely. So we've done a lot, but the Senate's going to have to figure out how to function, and then I think we can make some progress.
Oh, that's a big assumption.
Well, we're going to do the best we can.
And one thing that I've been wondering is whether the dramatic expansion of the child tax credit and the EITC is going to take some of the, might potentially drain some of the energy away or take the place of, as a practical matter, provisions to provide tax credits for early childhood education and childcare.
All of these things are cumulative, and you will hopefully get to the point where, with the accumulation not only of the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, SNAP benefits, and everything else, that people will not be increase the minimum wage, that people who are working are not in poverty. We're not that far away. I mean, if we increase the minimum, if we pass the minimum wage bill, that would get us a good way there. The child tax credit will take us a good way. The earned income tax credit will help. All of these things help. And if you look at it's just not a coincidence. So it's $1.9 trillion. We're able to cut child poverty in half, increase SNAP benefits, help homelessness, $1,400 checks, help small businesses. I mean, we just on and saved over 1 million people's pensions, massive investments in education, putting the money where it's most needed. We did a lot in the bill compared to the $1.9 trillion about 3 years ago, where 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. I mean, there's a stark contrast. So, you know, if we get another shot at that kind of money, we should be able to continue making progress. Early childhood education, I think there is a consensus that, and in early childhood opportunities, I mean, if you just do the student-teacher ratio, you know you've got a very expensive deal. If it's 4 to 1, each student has to pay 1/4 of a teacher's salary. Well, if that's quite an imposition. Unless you have some kind of subsidy, that's going to be hard to do, and that's why these investments are so important.
And do you think, just one last question, I'm sure you have votes and I don't want to hold you hostage here. Do you think that there is now bipartisan understanding of the imperative of early childhood education, or is there still a lot of education, if you will, to do?
I think there's still some more work to be done, but I mean, I think people are getting the idea. I remember a few years ago, one of my colleagues said that when he was in the state Senate, they did a study on how to improve academic achievement in high school. And after a year study, they came to the conclusion that the way to improve academic achievement in high school is to put all your money, all your new money into early childhood education and wait 10 years.
Yeah.
That's how you improve academic achievement in high school. And I think people are noticing this book shows the research and the imperative that if you miss K through birth through cradle through kindergarten, if you miss those years, you're playing catch up. And if you invest well in those years, you're really on the right track.
Well, thank you so much. I wanted to invite the other panelists at this point to turn on their video so we can see all of you. Hello, nice to see you. I wanted to maybe go around a little bit of a lightning round and ask everybody sort of their one takeaway from what we learned from the pandemic, lessons of the pandemic. Maybe Miriam, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. I'm so honored to be here. A big fan of this work. And it was so thrilled to be able to work with the research team on a plan for Oregon. Let's see, great question. What is a big takeaway from the pandemic? I mean, I think this almost sounds trite at this point, because we've heard so many references to childcare is essential, childcare workers are essential workers. But I do feel like hopefully there is a recognition now. I mean, that we cannot come out of this effort of this pandemic without greater investments in childcare and early care and education, and that awareness is not a conversation that the field of early childhood is having amongst itself, but it is much broader. When the vast majority of businesses and life was shut down in our state, in the same way that we needed firefighters and public safety officers and healthcare workers, we needed childcare to be able to respond to the effort, and we're going to need childcare to recover. So I just hope that that's something that we can't unsee again. The fact that it was so vulnerable and it did not have the infrastructure needed to sustain it, and we've had to build it quickly and with a lot of support from federal government should, I think, open all of our eyes. That part of being prepared, hopefully in the future, for whatever comes our way. We've had wildfires in Oregon. We've had a lot this year. We can't neglect the need for childcare as part of essential infrastructure.
And so, Ajay, am I saying your name correctly? You're muted also. There you go.
I'm fine with Ajay or AJ.
Well, you tell me, and I'll try.
I mean, most people call me AJ.
AJ, okay.
Just because my kindergarten teacher called me AJ, and that's what stuck.
Well, what's your takeaway? And is there a little bit of a silver lining to the terrible ordeal we've all gone through? I
do think so. I mean, the biggest silver lining is that through the leadership of Representative Scott, Nancy Pelosi and President Biden and, everyone else, the Recovery Act is the largest investment in childcare policy that we've ever had as a nation. The pandemic led to paid leave in the United States for the first time. And I think going back to your first question about what the other ways that I think this pandemic really made things clear about things that we try to say in the book, but really wasn't out there, even among, the DC intelligentsia, was that the issues around childcare, around paid leave, around preschool were probably as acute for middle-income families as they were for low-income families. And that goes to quality, that goes to everything that we say. And as you look at our graphs in the book, the challenges for middle income group families are the same, and that was clear in the pandemic.
And is that a sort of an an effect that persists going forward in the sense that.
Yes, because we wrote the book in 2017 before this, but I think people saw that in the pandemic. And I think, the brilliance of, what Representative Scott and Senator Murray, started to do was really to show, you really do have to go to 150% of every state's median income. That really does cover about 3/4 of everyone in the state, because those are all, the top quartile have already learned this, and they've been doing this. The spending, they know how important early childhood is. In fact, they spend more in early childhood than they ever spend again on their kids, except for when they go to college, because they know what the payoff to that is. We just have to do that for everybody, and it really does go all the way that far. I'd say the last thing that I learned that I was impressed by in the pandemic was that, especially back last March and April, when the country shut down and employers were trying to get people back to work, was that it came through in a way that it never had before to the broad range of employers and state policy leaders, how essential people were, just workers, but how essential supporting their workers' needs to get them to work mattered. And I think that was, this pandemic has revealed so much, well beyond what we learned for ECE. But I think governors were talking about, well, and mayors, what are we gonna do so that we can get these workers back, And that shouldn't be how we think about early care and education. It should be about children first, which is what we say, but it's obviously that you can't think about children without their parents. And I think what families needed in order to survive and in order to participate in the economy became clearer to everyone.
Melissa, did you have additional thoughts on this, or?
So I would plus one to what Miriam said, which is this realization amongst a number of people that care is infrastructure. It is a public good, because it's not as though children's brains magically turn on at age 5 when we start with public education in this country. In fact, the opposite is true, as shown in Cradle to Kindergarten, that between birth and 5, children's brains are growing at the fastest gait that they will in their lifetime. And so the idea that with roads and bridges and all those sorts of things, we recognize that even if we're not going to drive on every road and bridge, there's a collective responsibility to pay for those things. And we recognize that no one family could really sustainably pay for a bridge or a road alone, but it benefits all of us. And childcare is much the same way. And for a long time in this country, it has been felt as an intense private responsibility. And there's been shame about the inability to navigate a very hostile system. And for providers, they're making poverty wages. Parents are paying unaffordable fees. And so this is a classic example of where public investment is what's actually needed in order to get to the system that we need. The other learning I will say that I think speaks to why the Child Care for Working Families Act going from 0 to age 13 is important is I think a lot of people have realized that childcare is education and school is childcare. That during the pandemic, I have school-age children and they need care during the day, and school, in addition to providing high quality education for them, is a place where they go so that I can work. And similarly, for parents who have have young children, I also have a preschooler. It's not just the childcare portion of it; their brains were getting so much stimulation and investment and socio-emotional learning from that time. And so this false idea that children's brains turn on at age 5 is something that I think we've really come to realize is not something that can be sustained from an educational standpoint, from a labor force participation standpoint, particularly for mothers. And so to sum up, I think we've all learned that care is infrastructure. It's a public good and must be invested in accordingly.
Taryn or Christina, do you want to pivot a little bit in your answers, but don't feel obliged to the degree to which you think the American Rescue Plan is going to be transformative in affecting this structure and solutions going forward?
Sure, I can start, and Chris, if you want to jump in. I mean, it is, as Ajay said, it's a huge investment, a historic investment in our early childhood system that is very much needed. I mean, I completely agree with what Melissa said about early childhood being a public good. And also with 2 children under age 7, I very acutely feel that. And I think this false dichotomy between childcare, particularly for children 0 to 5, and then education for 5 to beyond, it didn't make sense. And the pandemic exposed that lack of alignment, or this system that really didn't make sense beginning at age 5. And the American Rescue Plan does a lot to try to correct that. I mean, we have a sector that is largely privately funded by families who are at the lowest earning years of their careers, right, with young children. I mean, to really save for your child's childcare, you would have to start saving as a high school student. I mean, what high school student is thinking about their future child's childcare? There's not the same kind of low interest loans and other kinds of financing systems for many middle income and low income families. We just don't reach enough. And so I think this investment to shore up, to make sure that childcare and early education options are available when people are called back to work is key. And then also it can serve as a down payment for this longer term investment we call for.
And Christina?
Yeah, well, I would just add to what folks have said in general that I think the pandemic has highlighted too, and the Recovery Act as well, the degree to which states can't do this alone, right? So if we ever had a time in which we tried to get states to do a lot of things on their own without a lot of federal leadership, boy, was that 2020, right? And so if Oregon could have done it alone, Miriam would have done it because we know her and she could do anything. And Oregon did a lot, as you'll hear about from Miriam, but still states really do need federal partnership and leadership like the kind that Representative Scott and others of his colleagues have tried to get us to. And that's just so important. And hopefully we now have a window to build from.
Great. Congressman, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have any questions for these panelists, you've probably held some hearings in your career, so feel free to chime in.
No, I'm just delighted to have the documentation of the value of Cradle to kindergarten, because we, as someone just mentioned, you don't start learning when you're 4 or 5 years old. You really start at birth. The nurse visit programs have been shown to be so valuable, and you really have to take advantage of that. We found that just in workforce, a lot of women have left the workforce, as I alluded to in my comments, have just left the workforce because they're at home caring for the children. That's one reason we need to open the schools as well as provide the daycare. You're not going to reopen the economy until you get that fixed.
Right.
So we've got a lot of work to do, and I'm just delighted to see the documentation that we have a research-based, so we can refer to this. And they said just like they said in the book.
But this has been a little inexplicably cheery in the sense of talking about the promise of the American Rescue Plan and the silver linings of the pandemic, but it's really been devastating for a lot. I want to recognize that for a lot of families and a lot of children, and I actually wonder if somebody might want to speak to the impact that they think is going to happen on children in this very vulnerable age of this last lost year that we've had. So I don't know who is best on that.
Let me just say one thing. We put a lot of money in this bill in education and set aside 20% of it specifically to address learning loss. I think all of it ought to be addressing learning loss, but the fact that they got to spend 20% of it, they have to show exactly what they did, what their plan was, and what the results were, is going to be very important, because some of the students just didn't do so well with this distance learning thing. Some, did it kind of okay, but a lot of people went way behind. There's also a debate going on about assessments, whether we ought to waive assessments. Some of us feel that, oh, wait a minute, we're putting a lot of money in this thing. we want to know how far these children are behind, and we got to find out who they are and get them caught up. Because if they stay far behind for too long, it's going to be hard to ever catch up. And so we put a huge amount of money, and we distributed it according to the Title I formula, so that the money went to where we know it's most needed. And that was some of the very wealthy areas didn't get much at all. Some of the low-income areas got a lot, and we expect them to do a lot with it. There's hopefully this bill will be a model on how the federal government can improve education and can eliminate the achievement gaps.
So if I could add, Ruth, to what the Congressman said and your question about learning loss and what happens with the disruptions that we've seen to affect like children. First, I just want to say that there's a large effect that will be scarring from everything we learned from the Great Depression for generations. I mean, for this generation for a long time, and that's from birth to 25, I would say. In terms of learning and what impacts that has on skills over a lifetime, and opportunities and cumulative abilities. And when I think about kids, and we've already seen some really good studies on what's happening to children K-12 in terms of their learning loss, and really that. From a learning standpoint, the amount of loss indicates that it'll be hard just to get kids back to March of 2020. I mean, low-income kids especially, to where they were in March of 2020 because of learning loss in the midst of, lack of adequate infrastructure for supporting teaching and learning over the last year. But for kids birth to 5, again, it hasn't been as well studied, and I'm no expert on what has exactly happened. But I know Miriam actually shared a fact yesterday that 60%, and this is true of a Colorado survey that we saw, 60% had to end their childcare arrangement as the pandemic hit. So I have spent a lot of time, and as my colleague Taryn has as well, looking at childcare instability and what parents have had to do to patch through the last year. All of that, switching from one caregiver to another, figuring it out, providing divided attention because you also have to work for your family's livelihood. None of that is good for their kids. And I mean, certainly having more parent time, but the parent time is not necessarily always undivided, is good. I mean, we know that. Parents are the best caregivers. And non-parental care is also really high quality, but it needs to be stable and it needs to be, consistent. And I think that those experiences are tougher. And they may be especially tough, ages 2, 3, and 4. I think there's a way that infants, and this is more anecdotal from the experiences I have for people who I know who have infants, that time has actually been helpful for them to have with their kids. I mean, if they can manage the income situation, and certainly the federal COVID aspects have allowed families to at least manage some of the income needs. But I think for 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, these are critical ages, and a great deal of instability is, an adjustment is not how children develop and what they need.
Yeah, if I can add to what's been said too, the unstable arrangements are really problematic. And then if you layer on financial instability, we know how bad and how stressful financial instability, economic instability, losing a job, trying to find a job in the midst of this economy is just extremely stressful. And then you have your child you're trying to take care of a young child and foster their learning and their socialization when it's dangerous potentially to interact with other households. And so there are families who are struggling to put food on the table. Unfortunately, the American Rescue Package is really going to help that a lot. But this instability, I think, is on multiple levels for so many young children. And we know that early childhood is a particularly developmentally sensitive period to experience all of that.
And I just want to add in, because I know that we're talking about the effects on children, but the effects on women getting pushed out of the labor force do have effects on children. And we know that children do best in high quality, stable settings, whether that's with a parent or whether that's with a high quality childcare setting. So there's nothing wrong with mom going to work. And in fact, that extra income and economic stability can mean higher educational, healthcare, other outcomes for the child. The challenge I think that we're going to have in going forward with the relief money is that this is historic. It is the largest amount since World War II, and it's getting us back to where we were before. That's the goal, is to return us to the pre-COVID status quo with the relief money, because the hole that we dug for ourselves because of our lack of infrastructure, because we didn't listen to Representative Scott and Senator Patty Murray before the pandemic. And if we had, we would not be in this situation. But because we didn't, we lost a big chunk of our childcare. 1 in 6 childcare workers are still unemployed. And I think when we talk also about stable and high quality settings for children, we have to talk about the childcare workers in addition to the parents.
It's fascinating. It's like a bridge that suddenly crumbled, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the infrastructure analogy. And I wonder how hard it is going to be to rebuild that bridge. Does it?
I would amend that a little bit, Ruth. It just never was a bridge. I mean, it's been so threadbare in its existence.
Okay, it was
a tightrope. It was a tightrope.
Which is why I think
okay, one of those scary ropey things.
That's why the infrastructure argument is so important. The one that Melissa tried to make is that we don't. I mean, and why we say that you actually, and that's one of the biggest lessons that we learned working in the States, is that you can't actually do cradle to kindergarten with high quality unless there's actually supply and infrastructure. And so what I think is that we had a really threadbare, fragile system where we like cut all the ropes, because of COVID. And so we can't just go back to that. And I do think that, even the COVID money can get us even beyond that, beyond that rickety lack of structure. But we still have to go a lot further, both in terms of supply and supports for families and caregivers. To get there. So all to say, I think I tried to answer your question by saying it's actually much worse than where it was. And I do think that, we go a little bit beyond what we would need just to get back to where we were, but not far enough and not long enough to get to cradle to kindergarten. So, and I do think there's really good ways. You asked about the Recovery Act. There's really good ways for states and others to think about how do we use these resources to both get back and position ourselves for moving forward when Congressman Scott's bill does become law.
I like the when.
When? I mean, I'm not predicting when, but I believe our country will head there in time. I just don't know what time.
Miriam, give us a little bit of the view from the ground in Oregon. What had been going on, what was working, and where are things now?
Sure, absolutely. So we started to engage with this great research team before our 2019 legislative session. And I was really excited, I think, and drawn to the policy areas in the book because I saw a lot of resonance and alignment with the vision in of our governor and policy leaders in our state. So, for example, Head Start is our largest state investment. We invest in Head Start. That's our biggest investment and our longest standing investment in the state. We had a lot of momentum around paid family leave as a proposal. And there was a lot of work that had taken over a decade really to take shape to pass a dedicated tax to finance public education. What was really exciting and game-changing about that, I mean, it's a historic piece of legislation, the Student Success Act for Oregon, so I think that was expected. What was really incredible was the law, there was momentum to dedicate about at minimum 20% of that dedicated revenue to early learning, to a birth to 5 system, I think has been talked about here. Arbitrarily shouldn't begin at kindergarten or first grade, but really begins at birth because that's when we know learning starts. So you know, being able to work on sort of an Oregon version of these proposals and costing them out and saying what would they take in Oregon, I think was instrumental for us. There was so much resonance and alignment, as I've said. So what happened, you know, so much happened in that session. Paid family leave passed, the dedicated tax passed, 200 million in annual investment now dedicated to early care and education. Every Head Start teacher in our state got a raise. We expanded by 10,000 slots. We got a bill passed to say we didn't get there on childcare out of this 200 million, but a legislative task force was established that we looked at that happened through 2020 to develop a plan to address this. Prior to the pandemic, every county in our state was a childcare desert for infants and toddlers out of 36 counties. So lots of great things, a lot of momentum. I would say as the book
definition of a childcare desert.
Sure. So there's estimated one slot for every 3 children that we estimate would need care. So to give you a point of view for infants and toddlers, we had 1 slot for an estimated every 8 infants and toddlers that needed childcare in our state. So even with this, huge, this incredible achievement, I would say, as the book talks about, how do we get to scale? We're reaching 10,000 additional children, and we're tens of thousands children birth to 5 in our state that won't have an early learning experience prior to kindergarten. And for us, that can take place in a home, in a center, in a school, in a Head Start program, right? So to the point that was made earlier about scale, we're really not going to be able to scale in Oregon without support from the federal government, and really thinking about a partnership. Even with that incredible commitment, there's so much work to do. Workforce, so I'd say the annual operating cost, changing the financing structure, 70% of all of the revenue in the sector is based on parent tuition. The next largest investment is federal funds, about 19%, and about 10% state. So our state doubled its investment in early learning in 1 year with the passage of the Student Success Act. And we still had a long way to go to get to the Cradle to Kindergarten vision, right? And that this great team helped us work on. So beyond that, the infrastructure pieces, we're also not going to be able to scale quickly, even if the revenue comes to offset the operating costs and help with financing and affordability, if we don't address 2 big barriers, the workforce and facilities. So every community I go to in our state, it's, what would you need? What would it take to get more children and families served? What's the biggest barrier face? Finding qualified staff who are willing to do this work under these conditions and for this pay, and facilities, right? So those are things we definitely kind of need to work on. So where are we now? I would say, as Ajay pointed out, we've been engaging with families. We've learned 60% of our families experienced some disruption in childcare in this last year, in their childcare arrangement during the pandemic. Our community, we are approaching pre-pandemic levels in terms of the number of facilities that we had. And I think in no small part due to the federal stimulus funds that have allowed us to get direct financial assistance to providers, but we have 65% of the capacity that we had pre-COVID. So our infant and toddler care supply, last I checked, 18 out of 36 counties have fewer than 10 infant slots right now. We really need, as the book talks about, and make the second edition, the declining revenues in states. So even with all of this momentum and these great investments, how do we get back and go further, get back to where we were and go further along that plan, and implementing our sort of Oregon Cradle to Kindergarten plan is going to be in the short term a lot more help, given what our state revenue situation looks like, and a lot of other really other important priorities that our legislature has to fund. So I think. At the same time, I'll just say a little bit about infrastructure too. I mean, as I think about what it's going to take, even as resources come into our state, So much, we have just had to do such an enormous amount of work in a short period of time to even get resources to providers. So we right now have distributed over $80 million in our state in direct financial assistance to providers. The majority of these providers have never had a funding relationship with the state or received public funds. We've had to overcome barriers of technology, connectivity, how to get them a grant quickly, how to start subsidizing. So we literally, I describe it as, to get some of these providers funding, we had to build the road by starting by cutting down the trees, clearing the paths to be able to get resources. I hope we can continue to be able to support these providers because they need it. Like, how do we keep building on that mechanism to be able to start subsidizing sort of more of this care, because we know families can't afford to pay it. And then a lot, I think, about working conditions. At the start of the pandemic, something that I can't unsee is in the early days of the emergency, a toddler teacher posted on Twitter that she was going to work and she had 101 fever because she didn't have paid leave herself. And so I think these are some of the other pieces that we need to consider. Health insurance, paid leave for our workers, compensation, the training. We're scared that a lot of this workforce has detached. Pre-pandemic, about a third of our workforce turned over annually, birth to 5 educators. So this has been a year. I mean, I feel like we've staved off the worst, that our biggest fear was a prolonged closure would lead to a permanent closure. But we need to think about how some of these things that we've done, and while attention is on this workforce and what they need and how we get resources and how we finance these providers, how we reach them, how we support this workforce more directly, including on wages and working conditions, is are pieces that we need to do quickly to be able to build back and build back better.
I was wondering if you were going to say build back better. Quite a phrase.
Yeah.
Congressman?
Ruth, I'm going to have to leave. We got to go vote. But
Thank you very much for
keep up the
joining
good
us.
work.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman.
Stay safe. Melissa, can you amplify a little bit on the workforce challenges that we're talking about in this sector? Is it simply, I know simply is a strange word to use here, a matter of appropriate pay, or is it something more complicated than that?
Well, fair compensation is certainly one of the top issues that the workforce is facing because, right now, on average, childcare providers, early educators are making less than $12 an hour. They're twice as likely to be on public assistance. And I don't think that we can ignore the fact that the workforce is 93% women, and it is disproportionately women of color and immigrant women. And we have a long and ugly history in this country of devaluing care work precisely because of who does it. And so even though we know that 0 to 5 is one of the most important time periods, even though we know this is education, even though we know this is skilled work, the entire history, if you look back at the history of childcare, is a history of undervaluing the labor of Black and brown women, all the way back to slavery, all the way back to cutting domestic workers out of the New Deal. It's woven throughout various points in our history. And I think that actually, looping back to your first question, one of the things that is, I think, a learning from this pandemic is how essential these workers are. And so one of the things that keeps me up at night is that we have this $39 billion in the recovery or in the American Rescue Plan that needs to be spent over the next 2 years. If we don't make a commitment and lean into the righteous rage that women in this country have right now, and parents more broadly, to get sustained change, it's not like you can increase, like with unemployment insurance benefits or nutrition assistance or something like that, where you plus it up and then as the economy improves, people gradually transition off of it. There's a workforce on the other side of this. And so if we stabilize childcare and then bring providers back in and then don't follow it up with a big investment, then all the work that states did to rebuild this infrastructure, to recruit new teachers, to put in place new practices won't be able to be sustained. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's so important that we both celebrate the American Rescue Plan and also make sure our lawmakers know that we need this infrastructure plan that's coming up in the discussions to consider childcare as infrastructure and to invest in a multi-year plan accordingly.
Got it. I want to take some of our remaining time to just give maybe Taryn and Christina, others to chime in, an opportunity to talk about two things. One is this is the second edition, and what has changed in understanding and proposals. And a really much more fundamental question is I've probably been dipping in and out of writing about this issue and learning about it for 20 years now. And it was completely clear 20 years ago that early childhood education was essential. I think it was you, Ajay, who was talking about the best way to get people to succeed in high school. That seems like a no-brainer. And yet, edition number 1, edition number 2, we're still where we are, which is a little bit better, but not very far. So what have we learned? What's changed? And why is it taking so damn long? Taryn?
Sure. And I love that term, righteous rage, Melissa. That is very appropriate. So, I mean, I think we wrote the original Cradle to Kindergarten in 2016. It really focused in thinking about an alternative universe that didn't come to be, right? And it's a shared federal state plan, right? But it requires a lot of federal investment that didn't end up manifesting. But over time, over those last 4 years, states like Oregon and others have made early childhood priorities, and that's been really exciting. But we've also seen the limitations of what states and localities can do, particularly with funding. That political context combined, unfortunately, with a lot of the rhetoric and the widening inequality that had happened from a lot of what happened, the policies at the federal level, I think combined to really move the policy conversation in ways that I hadn't seen in the last, I've been working on this issue for 20 years, and I haven't really seen that conversation shift in this way. And we the second edition, we make our policies bolder. As Ajay said, we go up the income spectrum more so, recognizing that this is not a problem that's limited to low-income families. And this has systemic effects on workers who are usually mothers themselves. They're disproportionately women, right? So I think there's been a growing recognition. I think the vast majority of families have all parents in the household are working, whether that's a single parent or dual income families. And childcare costs have been going up and up and up. And families are really struggling. And so I think there's more of a conversation of that, and there's kind of the Overton window has shifted.
So Taryn, if I could add around the second part of the question that Ruth asked about, like, well, why didn't we do this 20 years ago? Why didn't we do this 30 years ago? I have a couple of, we talk about this a little bit in the book. So there, and I wrote my master's thesis in 1986 was like a mini version of Cradle to Kindergarten, not to mention everything else since then. And I like to say, I'm just trying to get the United States to get to 1990. Because, every other country in the world, and we talk about this throughout the book, every other country in the world had paid leave. Every other developed country in the world had paid leave by like 1985. And, we're one of 2 countries that don't have a national plan for what to do when somebody has a newborn, us in Papua New Guinea. And the knowledge is there. And the ironic part is, the United States, when it came to like child development and human development and investing in education to support a workforce and an economy, we led the world, from about 1890 till about 1955, when we were the first country to ever create anything that resembled universal public education. You know, we were the first country to have K-8 system. We were the first country to have a 9 to 12 system. We were the first country to do significant public investments in public universities and higher education. And all of that, most of that happened at the state and local level. And, you know, once it got to a critical mass, everybody had to do it. And there's, you know, lots of lessons, and that's one of the reasons that we had the economic strength we did in the 20th century. But, you know, I think one of the things we learned in the last 4 years, but has been there, you know, going back to, you know, probably 1980, probably 1968, whenever you want to call it started, is that we just have far greater political divide, particularly around these issues, than any place that did this back in the 1980s or 1990s. We just have a different vision of a social contract and different visions of the social contract within us. And I, you know, if anything, you know, I was just encouraged in last year by just how many Republican governors said, how come these essential workers can't get back to doing their essential work? And they're like, well, they don't have childcare. So I think a lot of it has to do with priorities and political divisions, all of which, you know, also changed in the last 4 years. I mean, and, you know, in some ways, you know, the pendulum swung so ridiculously in one direction that, you know, there may be an opportunity in the swing back to really say, okay, what really does matter? Unfortunately, there's about 50 things besides early care and education that are a mess in this country. But I do think that the understanding, and, you know, no one ever went as big. I mean, it was seismic. I mean, it wasn't in a time when it could happen, but it was seismic when Senator Murray and Representative Scott said, you know, we don't just have to tinker here. We really have to come up with a system that serves all these kids. And really, that had never been a legislative proposal in the United States until 2017. So
I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions, but Christina and Miriam, I think you both had things that you wanted to say. Miriam?
Sure. I think just to build on the question, I say I like to call it the isms. Why don't we have the system that we need? It's classism, racism, sexism, and adultism. It's also true that we invest more in children as they get older, and they are more like adults. They act more like adults. I think that that's, you know, one point. And I also feel like let's not lose the equity lens, I think, in this conversation. Even with universal systems and universal investments, we have to pay attention to equity and be intentional about equity. And I think there's a lot that came up, I think, in particular in the second edition, that's sort of going at those issues. I mean, you asked earlier, Ruth, about the pandemic. You know, something that I would say is absolutely needed is we have to vaccinate people, communities in deep poverty and in communities of color, or we're not going to get back to Head Starts opening in person. There's a lot of concern in our state. Oregon has made all of its childcare and early educators a priority for vaccinations already back in February. And that was a huge priority. So that can't be a lens that we lose in any of this, even if we try to make everything the same or open up all that opportunity. There is, and anytime there's a policy bottom, in my experience that I've seen, if we're not being intentional about how to close gaps based on race in particular and income, then you know, we're not going to achieve the outcomes that we want.
Christina, final thoughts before we get to questions?
No, these were really, really great answers. So more just a ditto, and I'm excited for questions.
Okay. So I haven't looked at these yet, so I'm talking while reading. Here is an interesting question. Might have gone to the congressman. How likely do you think it is that childcare will be included as an infrastructure investment in an infrastructure reform bill later this Congress, especially to help the childcare sector recover and rebuild from the impacts of COVID? Melissa, you might have answered some of this already, but.
So I would say that there is a lot of education to do to get to that place in a short period of time. So President Biden and Vice President Harris have been very forthcoming about talking about care as infrastructure, and that is a huge step forward. And it's part of what we need for folks to listen to, is listen to our president talk about care as infrastructure. I do think, though, that a lot of what will unfold over the next several months in Congress will depend on what unfolds in our communities across the country. Do people contact their members of Congress? Does the primal scream that the New York Times called it, of, parents and mothers across the country, and then the providers who have, been stretched thin, does that reach the ears of members of Congress? Because there's also a chance that it gets included, but not at the scale that it needs to. And so I think that if we really want to lean into this opportunity to do a big infrastructure package and get the financing and the structure in place for something like the Child Care for Working Families Act, and to be clear, not all of that can move through reconciliation. So it also depends if they're going for a bipartisan bill or if they're going through, a budget reconciliation process. But if it goes through reconciliation, we can either go big or we can, get something that's more contained. And I think we need to try to go big.
I'm going to combine two questions that I think are linked. One is to Taryn, which is about the research on the benefits of early childhood education. Is it simply the exposure to opportunities before kindergarten, or is there a significant difference for children who attend formal preschool? And the linked question is, while there is more money being put towards helping children catch up, there was already a massive achievement gap before COVID. Are there ways in which policy is helping to encourage a change towards teaching with more of an equity mindset, trainings on how to better engage with historically marginalized families and children? That's a lot to chew on there. I think that's another couple hours of discussion. Taryn, maybe you could go first, but I think others should probably chime in on that.
Sure, and Chris would be great answering this as well. I think, they're linked. You're exactly right, because what is high quality for a young child, what children need, are warm, responsive caregivers. And that could be parents, that could be not parents, right? We see many children being raised by grandparents and others, but spending a lot of their time in non-parental care settings. And so consistent, warm, responsive caregiving and developmentally appropriate stimulation. And that could be a formal curriculum in preschool or in a child care center based setting. That could also be a home-based setting. So, in our research, we find that on average, center-based settings provide higher quality care and they're less variable. Home-based settings, so whether it's a licensed family child care provider who operates a child care program out of usually her home, or whether it's grandma, can provide wonderful care. But it tends to be more variable. And so that's why we focus on center-based care. Center-based care is also much more expensive, and we see higher income families generally using center-based care, enrolling their children at younger and younger ages as well. But I'll turn it to Chris too for more about quality. And I should mention too that cultural responsiveness, excuse me, is an integral part of that sort of quality too. I mean, it's necessary that that children not be expelled, for example, because we know that unfortunately, particularly boys of color tend to be expelled from preschool settings. And so we need training and understanding and culturally responsive care and education.
Yeah, so those are fabulous questions. I'll just add a little bit to what Taryn had already said, very much hit the nail on the hammer. So I guess one thing I would say around really centering equity, which is absolutely what we need to do, both with the funds that we now have and hopefully with additional investment, we need to be looking at barriers to access that we have. So we do have some public programs that we know families, even though they're universal, have trouble navigating and figuring out how to enroll. So that needs to be front and center around how do families get into these programs and what those barriers look like. For example, DC is universal for 3s and 4s, but there are some gaps around who applies and things like that. At the same time, too, we also need to not go back to normal around the teaching and learning models that are happening in preschools. We have a great deal of evidence at this point that some approaches are more successful than others, but those are really the least likely to be used in models across the United States. So we need to turn the page in that way to curricula and professional development for teachers that we know just has pretty consistently delivered what we call the best bet for improving early childhood education in our book, and that other experts in the field have pointed to as well.
Anybody else? There's a related question. Well, I guess all the questions are related, but about how the early childhood education is or should be linked to K through 12 education. AJ,
This may be another meet.
Christina. Yeah.
I think Christina.
Well, sorry, yeah. I do a lot of alignment work, so I will talk about this. So in some ways, it's a matter of moving beyond what we typically think of as pushing K-12 down, right? So we have this idea that we need to push worksheets, for example, into kindergartners because they're not ready for first grade. And so what we really have to do is kind of push the best of early childhood up in many ways. So what we need to be seeing is K-12 as much learning from the best of early childhood around developmentally appropriate practices, having intentional play-based learning in kindergarten, first grade, so not letting those things go. So there are linkages that need to happen across those systems. In some places, we have a situation where preschool is just play, not just play-based, but just play. And then in kindergarten, the kids are kind of getting smacked because then kindergarten is sitting in rows doing worksheets. And so we need to bring those systems together so that they're both matching the science of how young children learn, and also so that kindergarten isn't just repeating where kids have had effective preschool, what they've already learned. So there is a tremendous, really important role to play there. And it's a great question to highlight.
If I could just add one thing to that and sort of build on that, I think Melissa said this earlier, like K-12 is care, childcare too, and childcare is education for young children. I think part of what we also need to bring up outside of the classroom is the focus on family support. I mean, I think here we know that K-12 not being in person disrupted families' abilities to go to work. They had to shift and pivot in our state to delivering food, to making sure families could still get meals, internet, laptops. Some schools started childcare. Our governor in the early stages of the pandemic said, I need schools to do childcare for school-age children. So I do think home visits, there's so much that's around the care part of education that I'd love to see come up from early childhood into K-12.
And also the supports that K through 12 has being offered back down to childcare. For example, school meals are fairly widely available, whereas the child and adult care food program, which is the early childhood program for childcare settings and after school settings, is not as widely available and things like that. So there's all kinds of wraparound supports around a school for children with disabilities or for people who have housing instability and all kinds of other challenges that because childcare is so patchwork and so underfunded, trying to provide anything more is like squeezing a balloon. You're taking it from somewhere else. And so this scarcity mindset has also pitted providers against parents and children against adults. And the scarcity mindset is part of what has to stop. We are a rich country. We can afford to invest in our children. We can afford to pay the women and disproportionately women of color who do this essential work good wages. And it requires a public investment and the political will to get there. But that is not we don't have to choose. We should not be pitted against each other.
Is there a resistance in some communities or among some families to early childhood education? In other words, an educational component that needs to be done to help families understand why they would want to be sending their children to preschool?
Ruth, I would say that I think that's pretty limited. In fact, when you asked the question earlier of Congressman Scott about how bipartisan is the understanding around ECE, there, like with the pandemic bill, there's a big difference between what the Washington lawmakers and their level of bipartisanship and what American families are. So, so American families, when they've been surveyed, have talked about, the differences between Democrats and Republicans and independents is minuscule. I believe, and it's been done every year since about 2013 by a really high quality, it's in the 80s or 90s for all three groups about the importance of early. And when you look at higher income families, Republicans and Democrats alike go to universal preschool when they can pay for it almost completely.
Bipartisan.
It's bipartisan. If they can afford it, they go. And they send their kids. So, so we know when families have the resources, what they do, and that's what they would do if we gave the resources to everybody, and if we built the infrastructure for them to be able to go. So I do think there's differences, maybe around 0 to 2, in just maybe not in what they do, because in fact I don't think this is much difference, but in sort of their philosophy and what they say. But I do think that the goals of universal early education. We just need policy to catch up to. I mean, working families of both political parties have struggled with this since, as you said, 2 generations now. And so I don't think it's a question of that. I mean, I do think there are values issues that, permeate American politics, but I think when it comes to the care and development of young children, for the most part, we've come to one place on that for a while. We just haven't come to one place on that in Washington.
Well, that is a very semi-hopeful note, I think, to end on in this really, really important, timely, and perhaps timeless topic. And I just want to thank you all for all the incredibly important and dedicated and just plugging away at it day after day and year after year, and especially during this pandemic while you were juggling all of your own issues as well. My daughters, who are in their 20s, reminded me every day of the pandemic how lucky I was that they were grown up enough to take care of themselves, sort of. So I just want to thank everybody who participated, who watched, who listened. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. I'm really, really pleased to have been a part of this. So thank you to everybody.